Senator Scullion.
Thank you, Mr Deputy President. I rise today to make a contribution to the debate on the address in reply to the Governor-General's speech in opening this parliament. It's an important debate and one that I'd like to use to talk about the challenges in front of us in Indigenous Affairs and our priorities for this term, and also reflect on the progress to date. I'd like to thank the people of Australia for re-electing the Turnbull Liberal National Government and the confidence they've put in our government and the agenda that we put forward. I would especially like to acknowledge the hard work of the Nationals led by Barnaby Joyce, Senator Nash, and the great achievement to add to our numbers in that other place and keep all these senators here. I acknowledge the hard work of Senator Nash and Canavan campaigning across the country, and equally impressive efforts of Senator Mackenzie, Williams and O'Sullivan holding their respective seats. The Nationals are a proud team in the Senate, and we've got a lot to be proud of over the last 6 months. I want to acknowledge the contribution of our staff, led by Scott Mitchell. The Nationals are truly a family, and Scott has done a great job in managing that family. The hard work was definitely worth it. Before I get into the substance of my speech, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of country on which we're meeting today and pay my respects to their elders both past and present. I'd like to especially make mention of Ms Tina Brown, who performed the wonderful welcome to country during the first sitting week. As I'll talk about later in this speech, I strongly believe issues in Indigenous affairs cross over the political divide, extending equally to the crossbenches. We must work together if we're to deliver outcomes for our first Australians. So I do acknowledge that the introduction of a formal welcome to country was something that those on the other side introduced, and it now holds a special place in our opening week. I think you'll all agree that Tina delivered a stirring welcome to country and builds on the strong legacy of the welcome to country that Auntie Matilda had delivered a number of times in this place. Following the election in 2013, I was delighted to be appointed to Minister for Indigenous Affairs, and I was humbled to be reappointed after the election this year. I see this as a great opportunity to make a fundamental change to this most important area of national policy. As I've often said, this is the only job I want in this place. The Coalition recognises and values Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander culture and people, and we're determined to make gains required to deliver better outcomes for our first Australians. To deliver this, we're committed to empowering local communities by increasing school attendance, providing more job opportunities and promoting community safety. These three priorities are critical to establishing the change needed to support better outcome for our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, particularly in remote areas, to ensure first Australians and their communities can realise their hopes and aspirations for the future, and that we make the gains required to meet closing the gap targets. The work program of my first term constantly evolved because of the discussions I've had in over 200 community visits in over 150 communities. Progress and priority in my portfolio should not just be judged or determined by bureaucrats or academics in the major centres based primarily in the southeast corner of our country. It is something we also need to hear from the people in the community, something we need to listen to, whether that community be in Redfern, Yalata or Yirrkala. I want to reflect for a moment on what Gallery Yunupingu recounted recently as part of his essay in the Monthly. And he said, "With my family, I have built Maningara into a place that we hoped all Yolngu places might be. Back when hope powered the homeland movement, men and women go to work and sweat for their wages, children go to school, old people are safer and happier, and we are making our way." It is these priorities that I have heard across this great country time and time again. They are priorities held as much by non-Indigenous people as our first Australians. And they were the priorities we all recognise needed to be acted on after many years across both sides of politics, where the change that Indigenous Australians should have expected had not been delivered on. Now, this change has not always been popular, and I acknowledge that we haven't always got everything right, but things have started to change, and for the better. Through the funding reforms we've introduced as part of the Indigenous Advancement Strategy, we now know for the first time where Indigenous Affairs funding is going, something I was never able to get an answer on when I was in opposition. We now have a much better understanding of what's working and what's not, and importantly, we now have approximately 55% of the funds for these programs are actually going to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander organisations. Despite some of the myths that have been peddled by those with alternative agendas, there's actually been a significant increase in the number of Indigenous organisations that have been funded. Still not high enough, and I'll be pushing to make sure good, robust organisations that are getting the job done are getting funded. And we would really hope that they would be run by Indigenous people, or have a high number of Indigenous people working for them, because that's the future. Increasingly, we'll work with communities to move beyond the old transactional way of doing business. We'd all know in this place that education is the passport to a better future for children everywhere. It's no different from Indigenous children wherever they live. The Coalition is committed to improving Indigenous school attendance and is working with states and territories through COAG to address the issue. Without a proper education, Indigenous children are more likely than not to be on a path towards welfare dependency, interaction with the justice system, poor health, poor housing, and little hope for the future that other Australians enjoy. The Coalition is using all possible levers to ensure Indigenous children have the opportunity to fulfil their full potential. That begins with being at school regularly to receive an education. Mr Acting Deputy President, significant progress has been made. Through our remote school attendance strategy, we are working with families, schools and communities to ensure more children regularly attend school to receive an education. The cycle of poverty and disadvantage ends with a good education. Through the remote school attendance strategy, the Coalition has started to turn around a long-term trend of declining school attendance to see many more children now regularly, as part of a daily pattern, attend school. More children in remote areas are now attending school on a regular basis than in the previous 5 years before we came to office. Employment is another of the Coalition's top 3 priorities for Indigenous Affairs. Now, we all know that a purpose in life is absolutely central to the way that people feel about themselves. The Coalition is going to continue to focus on new and innovative ways to support Indigenous Australians into real, meaningful work that provides the opportunity to move away from welfare reliance. One of the most common messages from Indigenous elders and leaders in communities is that passive welfare destroys individuals and home communities. They want governments to work with them to end this cycle, which only serves to entrench poverty and disadvantage. In remote communities, around 1 in 5 adults of working age receives some sort of welfare. Too many people move into welfare at a young age and stay on it for extended periods, sometimes for life. The Coalition's committed to delivering new and innovative support for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people seeking real, meaningful work. Reflecting the recommendations of Mr Andrew Forrest's creating parity review of the Indigenous training and employment programs, the Coalition has refocused training and employment programs to ensure they deliver real outcomes. Payment for employment programs are now directly linked to real job outcomes, and we've ended the cycle of training for training's sake. Training is geared to the skills needed by employers, and in securing jobs for individuals and training them into that job, this ends the old failed model of placing people on the never-ending cycle of training which leads nowhere and only compounds the individual's sense of failure as certificates are collected but no job eventuates. Payment for employment programs are now firmly focused on outcomes of at least 26 weeks of employment. This ensures employers, employment brokers, training providers stick with people moving from training to work and support them through this critical transition. This has led to a dramatic cut in the amount of churn that exists in our employment programs. We know that if we can support a person into a job and ensure they make it through the first 6 months, they are more likely to remain employed and end their personal cycle of welfare reliance. There's enormous goodwill amongst Australian employers to hire Indigenous people. Previous approaches did not, however, provide them with workers who had the skills that they need. We've addressed the needs of job seekers and employers and are getting results. Our coordinated approach to employment through Commonwealth procurement, public sector recruitment and work with some of Australia's largest employers are creating real job opportunities for our first Australians. Nationally, employment programs in my portfolio, along with Job Active, have supported Indigenous Australians into around 47,000 jobs since the 1st of July of 2015. This is around 47,000 people whose lives have been turned around by the ability to get off welfare and start to build a future through meaningful activities for themselves, their families and their communities. Our community development program, which commenced on the 1st of June of 2015, is getting people active and making remote communities better places to live. Almost 80% of participants in CDP are now placed in activities, compared to only 45% at the end of Labor's failed remote jobs and community program. There's been an explosion in the number of Indigenous businesses winning government contracts, thanks to the Coalition's targeted Indigenous procurement policy. This has been a real game changer. The dramatic increase in demand for Indigenous businesses is up from 6 million in 2012-13 to more than 200 million last year. This is driving a growing Indigenous business sector, providing even more job opportunities. We're working with Indigenous business leaders to further develop a strong, vibrant Indigenous business sector to ensure that Indigenous Australians share in our agenda for jobs and for growth. The Coalition's plan to build the Indigenous business sector will create new employment opportunities and help open up our Indigenous businesses to domestic and global markets. The Coalition will develop Indigenous business opportunities through three main initiatives: the $115 million Indigenous Entrepreneurs Package, building on our partnership with major employers through the Employment Parity Initiative to require companies to purchase more of their own goods and services from Indigenous businesses. So the Commonwealth has provided leadership, we have provided the infrastructure, we've provided the processes for assessment, so we would now call on the other government jurisdictions as well as corporate Australia to take the same road. We will be building on the outstanding success of our Commonwealth Indigenous procurement policy to ensure 3% of all government contracts are with Indigenous businesses by 2020. Building the capacity of our Indigenous business sector makes not only good economic sense for our nation and Indigenous Australians, it puts us on a path to meet a key closing the gap target. This term we will continue to focus on the significant numbers of Indigenous working age people who are disengaged from work. We'll work on youth transitioning from school to work, those moving out of the justice system, and expand initiatives that ensure demand for Indigenous businesses and Indigenous job seekers continues to rise. However, with nearly 80% of the Indigenous population based in suburban, regional and rural areas and serviced by mainstream programs, the Coalition will ensure a whole-of-government approach to ensure all employment programs are levered and coordinated to best support the particular circumstances of Indigenous Australians. Every Australian has a right to live in an environment and a home free from violence. Rates of violence in many Indigenous communities are too high. That's why safety is one of the Coalition's top 3 priorities in Indigenous Affairs. There is strong evidence that the key driver of violence in Indigenous communities, including family violence, are alcohol and substance misuse, child abuse and neglect, poor low school attendance and low employment levels. We're committed to practical action to create safe communities and preventing violence, whilst also ensuring that victims receive the support they need through targeted investments. We're committed to protecting Indigenous women and children, given that Indigenous women are 34 times more likely than non-Indigenous women to be hospitalised as a result of family violence. Indigenous victims of family violence make up about 25% of victims nationally. That is why the Indigenous Advancement Strategy included $32.2 million in the 16-17 budget to deliver a number of initiatives, targeted initiatives, to reduce Indigenous family and domestic violence as part of the 3rd Action Plan to reduce violence against women and children. As part of our $100 million package of measures to improve frontline support and services and lever innovative technologies to keep women safe, we have also allocated $21 million for specific measures to help Indigenous women and communities. We've invested $186 million across government in Indigenous-specific initiatives for women's safety and family violence protection. The Coalition is also committed to tackling the underlying disadvantage that increases the likelihood of a person coming into contact with the criminal justice system. I'm committed to reducing Indigenous offending, victimisation and incarceration by tackling the drivers of crime, including alcohol and drug misuse, poor educational outcomes and disconnection from employment. States and territories are responsible for their criminal justice systems, including policing, However, this, like many issues, needs governments to work together to ensure that we get better outcomes. In the 2016-17 year, the government is providing $256 million through the Indigenous Advancement Strategy for activities to improve community safety and address the drivers of Indigenous incarceration. The Coalition will maintain its focus on efforts to deal with the factors that lead people to prison in the first place and those factors that too often lead them back there too soon after their release. I'm working with Minister Cash, along with state and territory governments, Indigenous prisoners, Indigenous communities, service providers and academics to look at ways to better transition Indigenous people from incarceration to employment in order to reduce the risk of offending. A key focus will be working with states and territories to support rehabilitation and vocational training activities within the prison system and to ensure our post-release assistance leads to employment. These achievements have been possible because the Coalition is committed to working with communities. Through changes implemented by the Coalition, Indigenous Affairs is now at the heart of government. We have a Prime Minister, a Cabinet Minister, a Cabinet Subcommittee and an Indigenous Advisory Committee, all committed to delivering better outcomes for First Australians. We've directed funding away from bureaucracies and towards local communities. This work has been supported by the Prime Minister's Indigenous Advisory Council, led by the Chair, Mr Warren Mundine, and Deputy Chair, Nari Brown, which has provided valuable advice to ensure programs deliver real positive change in the lives of Aboriginal people. Significant reform to the delivery of program and services has seen Indigenous Affairs elevated to the peak of bureaucracy within the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, which ensures that every single decision of government is closely scrutinised for its impact on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians. We're focusing on genuine engagement directly with communities. We're working with traditional owners, elders and communities to identify the fundamental priorities and policy approaches that will lead to greater engagement in schooling, training and work and lead to safer communities. These things are fundamental to building healthy communities. Tackling years of disadvantage is an enormous challenge, but if we work in partnership between Indigenous people, governments, business and service providers, I believe that this can be done. And this is a challenge for all of us in this place, Mr Deputy President. It's not something that just rests with one side of politics. And if we take a political approach, we will not achieve the change that First Australians, and in fact all Australians, expect of us. And I call on all parliamentarians in both places to ensure that they get out into their communities and work with Indigenous Australians and come back to me and tell me what they think is working and is not working. And I know that a one-size-fits-all approach will not work, and ask for your assistance in ensuring that we're meeting the expectations of those people that we serve. I look forward to working with all of you over the next term and continuing the Coalition's significant results in Indigenous Affairs.